So welcome to our Data ID Services community call brought to you by US DOE's Office of Scientific and Technical Information, also known as OSTI. I'm Sarah Studwell, the data team lead, and joining me from OSTI today are Drew Hewitt, Stephanie Garrix, Neil Enzer, and Lori Johnson. So thank you everyone for joining today. There we go. So before we get started, just a few housekeeping notes. Please keep in mind this is being recorded. If you have any questions about the recording, please let us know after today's call. Everyone is initially muted, but if you'd like to speak up, you have the option to unmute yourself. We will be monitoring the chat. So feel free to enter your questions or comments in real time, and we will be sure to address them after the presentations. For our agenda today, Drew and myself will briefly touch on some DataCite updates. Then Joan Damerow of Lawrence Berkeley's National Labs ESS Dive will give a presentation on linking multidisciplinary sample data using IGSNs. After that, we hope to have time for questions and discussion. So I will hand it over to Drew from OSTI's data team.
Thanks, Sarah. So hi, everyone. Today, I'd like to talk about a search tool that you all may or may not know about, and that is called DataCite Commons. It's the successor to another search tool of DataCite's that's called DataCite Search, and it is quite wide-ranging and powerful since it's not so focused solely on DataCite DOIs. So I look forward to talking about this with you all today. Next slide, please. So what is DataCite Commons? DataCite Commons is a relatively recent tool that was created by DataCite, which is the organization that OSTI goes through to register DOE and IAD DOIs through our services. Today, we thought it might be useful to highlight some features from this powerful search tool that they have, and specifically related to how you might search your own DOIs here. So DataCite Commons is a web search interface for the PID graph, the graph formed by the collection of scholarly resources such as publications, datasets, people, and research organizations and their connections. The PID graph uses persistent identifiers in GraphQL with PIDs and metadata provided by DataCite, Crossref, ORCID, and others. And there's a link put there in the chat if you want to browse and play along as we kind of go through this. So yeah, this is a really powerful search tool, and they're still working on it, making improvements, but they're really trying to link persistent identifiers that collect organizations, people, research objects, and so it's pretty exciting and an interesting tool to use. Is there issues? Oh, okay, I see somebody didn't see any slides. I'm seeing the slides. So Janet, you might try logging out and logging back in there. All right, let's see if there's anything else there. So we can go to the next slide. Okay, so really quick, I'd like to go over these three different search options you have when you go to DataCite Commons. The first one you'll see is Works, and it's highlighted in green there. So you click on whichever one you want to search, and then you can perform the search. Works are any sort of research output related to a DataCite or a Crossref DOI. This is where you will do most of your searching and where we will be focusing on today in our examples. Next slide, please. Then you have People. People directly queries the ORCID API to pull useful information about an individual, such as DOE lab researchers. So this is, individual researchers have ORCID IDs, and you can enter either a person's first and last name and choose that individual from a list, or you can put that ORCID ID in the search and you can find that exact person. And then you can look at that person's ORCID information within DataCite Commons. Next slide, please. Next, we have organizations. This is pretty similar to People, but for organizations. It relies on the Research Organization Registry ROR API to view output from a research organization. For example, if you're part of a DOE laboratory like Oak Ridge National Lab or Argonne National Lab, more than likely your organization has a ROR identifier, and that's a way for you to see research output from these organizations here. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's talk about some DataCite Commons search tips, because it's a really great tool, but you need to know how to search it to really take full advantage of it. So as I said, this is a pretty powerful search tool. You can search with Boolean operators, wildcards, and Elasticsearch. And we just put the link in the chat for Elasticsearch guide to how to query with that sort of searching. To properly use DataCite comments, you must search by exact DataCite metadata fields found in the DataCite schema. So we require you to submit in your API submissions specific OSTI fields, which may not be the exact same as the DataCite field. So you should look at the DataCite schema to make sure you're using those exact field names in your searches. Also, your searching is case sensitive. In the example I have below, if you want to search for last names, you must express it the following way. This is the DataCite metadata schema, creators.family name, and you need to capitalize the N in family name, then colon, and then in this example, Smith. Or if you'd like to use a wildcard, you do that same search, but you put an asterisk at the end, and that'll get anything that starts in SMIT in that specific DataCite field. Let's see, next slide, please. Okay, so here are a few examples that we wanted to provide for you all today so you can practice searching DOIs related to your organization. You can search your DOIs by prefix. Whenever you are registering DOIs, more often than not, you have a unique prefix for your DOIs. So in this example right here, you can search DataCite Commons by a prefix. In order to only search the DOI field, you need to enter DOI all in lowercase and then colon, and then you add your individual prefix. In this example, we have the ESS Dives prefix, which is 10.15485, followed by an asterisk to get that wildcard. So when you hit enter, you get all of the registered with DataCite DOIs that can be found. And in this example, there are 243. Also, just a little note here, many of you are reserving your DOIs as well, and these will not show up in the search because they have not yet been registered with DataCite. Next slide, please. Okay, searching your DOIs by infix. It's very similar to the previous search we did in that you're searching that DOI field. So you pretty much do the same thing, except for you'll add that infix at the end followed by an asterisk. And this can be useful if you are using infixes in your DOIs. Not everybody uses infixes, but some people do because they like to be able to differentiate their DOIs based on projects or other types of research. So that can be a great way to search as well. Looks like we have a question in the chat from David Crocker, which is, are entrained wildcards allowed? David, can you explain what an entrained wildcard would be? Because I'm not familiar with that term. I will say that at the end of this presentation, we will have a link to the DataCite Supports webpage that gives info on many ways you can search. This is just kind of a brief overview. Let's see, David asks, can you put an asterisk in the middle of the search, not at the end? I believe that is possible. I have not tried that myself, but it is using Elasticsearch, which I believe allows you to do that, but I would have to check that. But I believe you can put a wildcard just about anywhere. Okay, next slide, please. All right, so here's one final example we wanted to touch on, which is searching based on a publication date. This is just to kind of show you in action how you can use Elasticsearch along with DataCite schema to do some really cool searches. In this search, we are searching for any example of coronavirus with the Boolean operator and to require the DataCite metadata field of publication year to be less than or before 2019. So when you do this search and you put that in the search bar, it will yield the following. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see we have almost 2,000 works, all before the year 2019. So that's just kind of a cool way to search DataCite Commons. And what I find interesting about DataCite Commons is that it's not just publications you're searching here. Since it's Crossref and DataCite DOIs, you have publications, but you also, like in this example, you have a conference paper and you also have a figure from a publication. So, because DataCite DOIs tend to be for just about any sort of research output, you can really get a broad idea of what has been done on a specific subject. Next slide, please. So that's all I have today. It was just kind of to give you all a brief idea of what you can do with DataCite Commons. We put the link into the chat and it's also here on the slides. DataCite has an entire support page with a lot of cool links that you can follow to do some more advanced searching here, but feel free to try it out and you can kind of play with how you can view your own DOIs and also view other research outputs there. So that's all I have. And now I will turn it over to Sarah to discuss another DataCite update.
Thank you, Drew. That was great. Now I'll just give a quick update on a new partnership that was recently announced between DataCite and IGSN. First, I will give a brief introduction to what IGSNs are, as I'm sure Joan will go into more detail in a little bit. The IGSN is a globally unique and persistent identifier for material samples. It's the International Geosample Number. And it's common in many disciplines, including natural and environmental sciences, material sciences, agriculture. The IGSN EV is the implementation organization of the IGSN. So the formal technical name is the International Geosample Number Implementation Organization EV. It was established back in 2011. It's a nonprofit that serves as the central persistent identifier registration system for IGSNs. And as they state, the objective is to implement and promote standard methods for identifying, citing, and locating physical samples with confidence by operating an international IGSN registration service. And the link there on the slide is to their organization page. So in 2018, IGSN launched the IGSN 2040 project. It's funded by the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation. And that was to create a strategic plan and roadmap for evolving its technical platform and governance structure and kind of professionalize its operations. Up until this point, it's been largely volunteer run. So just recently, IGSN and DataCite announced they would be forming a partnership where IGSN registration services would be offered through DataCite. The goal is to formalize this agreement by the third quarter of 2021 and work to transition services by the end of this year. There's more information in the DataCite blog post linked on this slide, but we are closely following the developments of this partnership and we'll be able to provide updates as we learn more as well. So if there aren't any questions, I will turn it over to Joan to talk about her work linking multidisciplinary samples using IGSNs. Thank you so much for being here today, Joan.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. So I am the community engagement lead scientist now for ESS Dive. So I help run our community engagement activities and also working with the community to develop a variety of different data standards for specific data types. And a lot of my work is really focused on samples and using IGSN. So we started this work in 2019 to figure out, to work with the community on a standard approach for sample identifiers and descriptions for samples. And that's how we started working with IGSN. And I served on the IGSN steering committee in last year as well, as they were working on their DataCite partnership. So let's see. You can do the next slide. So throughout the presentation today, what I want to do is introduce this general challenge that many projects were facing in sample tracking. We'll then review some common approaches for assigning sample identifiers and some of the more complex sample hierarchies that many multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary projects have, and then how we are starting to use IGSNs for sample tracking and linking across data systems. And there's what we're doing is kind of building the foundations for being able to have better tools for automatically tracking and linking related sample data. And a common theme, a theme that I want to get across is that what we really need is a common approach for multidisciplinary sample identifiers and metadata. And the purpose of this is to enable more effective sample planning, tracking, discovery, and reuse. Next slide. And our work at ESS Dive on samples was based on a pilot study that we did starting in 2019 with 8 different national lab projects. And this is discussed extensively in the paper that's linked here on the slide. We also have detailed documentation on guidelines for sample identifiers and metadata. And much of this is based on the IGSN metadata schema that was developed by the System for Earth Sample Registration. We are using the System for Earth Sample Registration to obtain our IGSNs. And so we've just made some modifications and enhancements to support the environmental system science community, which is so ESS Dive supports the environmental system science program, and we accept all data that is funded by the DOE's environmental system science program. So I'll also be giving a tutorial on how to use ESS Dive's recommended sample ID and metadata reporting format on July 12th at 11 a.m. And I think that Stephanie is putting a link to a description of this tutorial. And if you want to register, you can do that on the link as well. And I also realized here that I should have included a slide on some of the broader efforts that are happening right now around improving sample standards and cyber infrastructure, and also cross-discipline coordination around samples. So there were 2 recently funded grants. One of them was funded last year called the Internet of Samples, or iSamples, and they are working towards an interdisciplinary cyber infrastructure to support sample management and publication and obtaining sample identifiers. And there's also an associated research coordination network grant that was just funded called Sampling Nature, and they're just now getting started, and they will be supporting the work also that's being done by iSamples through more community efforts on deciding on common approaches and promoting adoption of sample standards. So we can expect to see a lot of progress towards better infrastructure to support sample management and publication, and hopefully more widespread standards adoption in the near future. Next slide. So now I just want to introduce this sample tracking challenge that we are attempting to address in our work on sample identifiers at ESS Dive. Next slide. ESS Dive is a really community-focused repository for earth and environmental science data, and we do a lot of site visits and have a lot of discussions with individual projects. And early on, when the repository was getting started, we're pretty new. We started in April of 2018. And we found that projects were facing a particular challenge in efficiently tracking samples as they are sent to different collaborators, labs, and facilities. Next. For a variety of different physical, chemical, and biological analyses, and then integrating sample data effectively for these kinds of interdisciplinary projects as data is added and transferred across numerous different data files and published in different places online. Next. It really requires globally unique and persistent identifiers. You can do the next. And that is where we came to the conclusion that the international GEO or general sample numbers, known as IGSNs, were a good solution here. And one key thing is that these identifiers were specifically designed for samples, and they're associated with standard metadata that is designed for samples. Next slide. And so what I want to do now is just briefly review some of ESSDI's recommendations for sample identifiers and metadata, which are closely aligned with the general IGSN schema. Next. And to make sure we're all on the same page with terminology, I'll just define a few terms. Many of you are very aware of some of these terms, but they have a slightly different meaning in the context of samples. So a unique identifier provides a meaningful project-specific unique identifier to organize and track sample data within a given project. But once these kinds of identifiers are then published online, they become somewhat less useful because they're not meaningful in a broader context, and because they may be repeated in other data sets and in other samples. But they are very useful for internal projects tracking. So within our metadata template, this is known as the sample name, and it may have some meaningful codes such as a site code, a sample code, and an indication of the sample date. Then we have sample metadata, which characterizes samples and details on how those samples were collected. And this includes a high-level controlled vocabulary for sample type, a controlled vocabulary for the environmental context or physiographic feature. For example, you may have a water sample that was collected from a stream, and then a description of the location. Then there are persistent identifiers, which everyone here is well aware of. And these are globally unique IDs, as we've discussed, with a permanent link or landing page, and also associated metadata. For samples, IGSNs, they are designed actually to fit on sample labels. The standard is a 9-character code, and then each of these is associated with a permanent link or landing page, and I'll show you an example of that. Next slide. This is just a summary of the ESSDI IGSN sample metadata, and overall, these describe sample collection details such as the date, the location, the latitude and longitude, environmental context, a description of that material sample and what it consists of, the high-level sample type and the material. And then also an important piece of this is related identifiers. IGSN currently tracks a lot of the sample relationships through parent-child relationships. So for every sample, you indicate a parent, so you can represent some of the sampling hierarchies. We've also added some other related identifiers, such as location ID, because many samples within environmental systems science are related based on a particular location, or perhaps a collection event, or just some other general way that a project may want to organize a collection of samples. And we've added an identifier called a collection ID. And these related identifiers are based on identifiers that came from Darwin Core, which is a standard for biological observations and specimens. Next slide. And this is just a depiction of how you might link related samples using the identifiers in the parent-child relationship. This is kind of a common simplified version of linking different sample types based on a location ID. You may have a parent sample like a soil core that's then divided into different core sections that we're taking at different depths, and then a core section may then be divided into multiple subsamples. And so each sample you record the parent, and then all of these relationships are tracked in the landing page. And so you have links to the parent samples and the sibling samples and the children samples. and it's done automatically when you submit your metadata to the System for Earth Sample Registration. Next slide. During our pilot test, where we worked with 8 different national lab projects, multidisciplinary projects, we also worked with many of them on a sample journey map as one tool to decide how to organize their samples and assign sample identifiers. And so this included the any collection identifiers, site identifiers, sample processing and preservation, and then also all of the different analyses that were conducted on a given sample. And you can see how many of these samples have a series of analyses that are associated with them. And it's really useful to have a common machine readable persistent identifier to be able to track that information. And then the samples are then published in different data systems. This particular set of samples has information in the System for Earth Sample Registration on the individual samples, in ESS Dive on some of the physical and chemical analyses, and then GOLD, or the Genome's Online Database, for the genomic and metagenomic data. Next slide. And again, at ESS Dive, we did some extensive background research through this pilot study to determine how we might use IGSNs for sample tracking and linking. And so we're just beginning to, many of our projects that assigned IGSNs now have the resulting data from that. And so we're starting to add in links to related identifiers. This is an example just showing the soil sample landing page. This is what an IGSN landing page looks like when they are submitted to the System for Earth Sample Registration. They all have the standard URL. The IGSN, you can see, is at the end of the URL, and each IGSN has the same prefix. So once you have the IGSN, you can associate that with the landing page for that sample. You can also add relevant related links, related URLs. And so we've started doing that for this set of samples. And we have, in this example, a link to the ESS Dive data set for a variety of different soil measurements. And so you can have those two linking back to one another. Next slide. So in some cases, a locally unique and meaningful project sample name may be sufficient. But when there are many cases where IGSNs are most useful, and that includes when projects have samples that are used in multiple data sets and journal publications, samples that may be sent to numerous collaborators who work on the same samples or maybe adding data over time, samples that are sent to multiple labs for a variety of different analyses, or published in different data systems or repositories. And again, we'll discuss some of this in more detail on how to use this in our sample tutorial that'll be on July 12th. Next. And samples do provide a good example for how multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary data in particular may originate or exist in different data systems. So this is showing an example of how, for a given project, FTICR analyses may come from the Environmental Molecular Sciences Laboratory, or EMSL. Genomic sequencing data are published on JGI's Genome Online Database, or GOLD. Modeling work may take place on the DOE Systems Biology Knowledge Base, or KBase. If we have a persistent identifier, this provides a powerful way to be able to link and exchange information across these facilities and data systems for the individual samples. And this can improve our ability for people to find, compile, and interpret, and then reuse this multidisciplinary sample data. Because currently, much of this data is very disconnected, and the only way to compile it and bring it together is through manually linking the information using the project provided like unique identifier. And it's currently a very manual and cumbersome process. But if we start using persistent identifiers and standard metadata, that this then provides a foundation to build automated tools to be able to link this information more easily using automated approaches. Next slide. So we have started working through use cases with across ESS Dive, NMDC, KBase, JGI, and EMSL to start adding these URL links with descriptions of what those links are to test how we can associate these IGSN sample landing pages with the ESS Dive data sets, and then also the associated data in GOLD, NMDC, EMSL, and KBase. So our goal in this work is to determine how we can add these links automatically using the DOIs and IGSNs and the associated metadata to make publishing this kind of interdisciplinary sample data easier and to make the published data more complete and usable. Next slide. So again, these IGSNs can enable us to track samples and exchange related information over time and across different online data systems. And so we are working towards working across these DOE data systems in biological and environmental research. And the purpose is to link related sample metadata and data. We want to go through use cases to determine the most useful approach for this and to come to an agreement there. And the ultimate goal is to really make this complex sample tracking easier for both people who are submitting data and also people who are attempting to use this kind of multidisciplinary data. And so, next slide. With that, I'd like to thank you all for listening, and I have a few links here that may be useful if you're interested in learning more, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thanks so much, Joan. I'll kind of open it up to the group now if there are any questions for Joan.
Included some additional links that Joan provided just in case you guys, those that are in the chat now.
Thank you. And yeah, this is very impressive work and quite complicated. I think a lot of people have been educated today on some new stuff. But if there are not any questions right now, I know that Joan had a few that she'd like to pose to you, and we're going to be using Mentimeter for those. So if you can, could you please click the link that's going to be put into the chat, or go to menti.com on your phone or in your browser and enter the code 4049953. And then I'll wait just a minute to let everyone get there. And then once we have a good group, I'll let Joan go ahead and pose her questions.
Yeah, thank you. So if you do collect or manage sample data, the first question is, where is your sample data currently stored or published and archived? And some examples of this may be that it's not published anywhere and it's currently in personal files or in a project database, or maybe it's published somewhere like ESS Dive or GOLD. So yeah, just looking for examples of where your sample data is currently stored.
Sorry, there you go.
So for whoever put data.pnnl.gov, could you go into detail about how you're storing that sample data?
Sure. So the data.pnnl.gov is just a front end, it's just a catalog. The data is actually stored on a, technically it's stored on a tape archive system on the back end. So this is for machines, for Joan and the ESS Dive folks. It's more for machines that are not part of EMSL that are located at PNNL. So there's still a lot of instrumentation that's not part of EMSL that's here at PNNL. And so we do a similar, we're trying to mimic a similar thing that EMSL's doing with their infrastructure and their instrumentation. And we also have a tape system that it holds.
Interesting. And then we also have someone from Ag Data Commons. USDA supported researchers can upload files, whatever data type they have. And I like the comment that this is new to me, that they have no idea how the researchers store their sample data. Joan, I'm sure you can speak to that it's definitely something that.
Yeah, it's definitely new. And I do understand that many in this audience won't actually be collecting some of this data. They may be supporting researchers who collect this kind of data. So it is good to kind of just learn about some of the activities that are now occurring around samples. And I think we are going to see a lot more movement towards publishing and standardizing sample data in the future with some of these recently funded grants and community activities.
I agree with that. And also with what we had spoke about, the DataCite IGSN partnership, which I think towards the end of the year will be finalized. That metadata will be held as well in DataCite searches and will help interlinking this IGSN with DOIs much more prominent.
Excellent. Well, I will move on to the next question, but if anyone wants to jump into chat or speak up, by all means, go right ahead.
Yeah, so the next tool is, or the next question is, what tools do you think could be useful for sample management and tracking across multiple data systems? And this may be a good question for this audience, and just thinking about, like, if we have these persistent identifiers and standard metadata for samples, what do you think, what kind of tools do you think would be useful? Things, just, automated tracking and of samples across different data systems in some way, like adding automated linkages when you see when an IGSN is identified within individual data files, or just APIs to create these linkages automatically. Like, what can we do with persistent identifiers and sample metadata? Someone added related identifiers and tracking links between DOIs, IGSNs, and other entities like Sarah introduced earlier, and automating these links.
So Joan, is that currently IGSN and O are the relevant PIDs? So that's kind of what you're doing right now on ESS Dive on the landing pages, is using that related identifier to link the IGSNs to other persistent identifiers.
Yeah, but right now
that's being done manually.
Yeah, right now we're doing it manually just to identify exactly what we want to be able to link and how we want to do that and what information we need.
There's a suggestion, especially with DataCite, with the new partnership, that the product type was specified as sample. You can filter it that way.
Yeah, the object type.
So Joan, I didn't join the Mentimeter, but if you're talking pie in the sky kind of tools, a change brokerage. Any kind of change that comes in on a sample, it gets distributed out to anybody that's interested in finding out more about that sample.
Thank you. That's a good suggestion.
I like the comment, whatever decreases administrative burden on researchers.
Yeah, I mean, we definitely need better tools to be able to register samples in a central place and manage those samples and all of the metadata and data that are associated with them. And again, iSamples is going to be working on a lot of this and building tools that can then be adopted by organizations. They're working on something called iSamples in a Box, which would provide a standard set of tools that organizations could then kind of take over and adopt for their own purposes and make modifications as needed. And this would include like sample registration services and things like label generators, which the system for Earth sample registration already does, but they're working on improvements to those and making them more generalizable. So currently, it's not as easy as it should be to get these identifiers and manage samples, but there are a lot of things happening that will make this process easier, hopefully.
Absolutely. We will move on to the next question.
And this may not be a good question for this audience if we don't have a lot of researchers. But in general, do you have any thoughts on what's needed for multidisciplinary sample data interpretation and reuse? So I'm just thinking about what other future researchers would need to do to be able to compile and link related data from a given project. And as I mentioned before, a lot of the sample data is currently disconnected, and the process for pulling that information together often involves contacting the specific PIs and extensive research and like looking up individual papers. There's often not really a way to find all of the related data just through your data searches. There's a lot of manual research that has to be done in contacting the original researchers. And so that's what we're hoping to get at with some of these standards for sample identifiers and metadata.
Yeah, and I definitely agree with one of the comments here about the minimum standard metadata. And, of course, having more robust metadata always makes it easier to find what you need. It's just getting that as well. So we also have a question in the chat from Terry. What is the definition of a sample and how to think about the parent-child relationship? And where is a list of the object type? I think she's referring to the data site object type. I'm also thinking back to my days working with herbarium zoological collections.
Yeah, and so it does get complicated, the definition of an individual sample, and it's really project-based. So in general, just a sample is a material entity that was collected often from the environment. It's a representation of a collection from the environment. And so I have the example in the slide where we show some of the potential sample hierarchies that you may have, like a soil core may be collected that then has multiple core sections that were collected at different depths. And depending on what research question you're asking, you may, the sample that you're dealing with may be that core section, or it may be like individual subsamples that are then sent to different analyses. So it's really project specific. But one conclusion that we've come to is that if we do want to be able to link related data across different data systems, one of the more important sample identifiers is just having like a primary IGSN that is then that may then be applied to multiple different sample containers, for example. And these containers are sent to different facilities for analyses. And we want to be able to use that IGSN in a clear way to link those different analyses together. And so instead of like one big question that came up was, do we want to assign IGSNs to all of these individual samples so that we can track it on that level? And it seems like we're kind of converging more towards we just want one identifier for this sample that was sent for a variety of different analyses as a mechanism to pull that information together, if that makes sense. But it is still very project specific and dependent on how the project wants to track that information. It's just important that you have the sample relationships described in the metadata. And IGSN has simplified that by only asking for a parent sample. There may be other samples that are other relationships that you want, that a project may want to represent. And so we will continue discussing that with projects to make sure that we have, that there aren't additional relationships that we need to be tracking. It does get complicated, and it's kind of a complicated topic.
I think it's very much like the discussions that happen across the data community now, where, you know, levels of granularity, what level to assign a DOI to data, and then, you know, the linkages, parent, child, sibling, you know, it's all interconnected and trying to tell the complete research story, or in this case with samples, trying to link those samples to the greater research environment, kind of like we do. It's based on the needs of the data owner or how they want to define it. Yeah. And then a list of the object type. Terry, I believe you're asking about data site there. Drew, I believe that that would be listed in the support documentation on DataCite's website, correct?
Yes, you would find DataCite types on the DataCite metadata schema as well.
Great. All right. Let's see. Well, thank you very much, Joan. We just had we have a couple of minutes, and so we'll ask a couple of other questions just to get a little bit of a broader read on the participants today. For today, had you heard of IGSNs? Very obvious multiple choice answers, yes, no, vaguely, but not clear on what they were. So, and anyone who speaks to the vaguely and not clear, feel free to kind of speak up and explain your what's the word I'm looking for here? What you thought they might be. Yeah, it looks like this is new to a big part of the community, which is great, because samples are such a big element of a lot of research disciplines, and so having a persistent identifier for them is going to be great for relating research. Okay. And then jumping back to the beginning, before today, had you ever used DataCite Commons? Yes, no, or you're not sure. Well, Drew, it looks like you gave a great introduction to DataCite Commons.
Well, I will say it's a pretty new tool, so that makes sense, but you all should check it out and see how you might use it. I know there's also an API as well that you can query from.
And absolutely, as you use it, feel free to reach out to us with any feedback or questions, because it's new to us as well. So we're checking it out. Well, this one is obviously not applicable to this group. So I will skip over to the next one. Which other tools do you use to find data records? How do you search for data? So are you looking at the Google dataset search? Are you using data specific repositories? And then in there, do you search by DOI? Do you search by the title of the data set, creators? Or are you looking for data at all? Searching by DOI. Title or author creator. Prominent metadata fields for sure. Excellent. DOI or title, there we go. All right, well, thank you so much. And thank you so much, Joan. I just want to give a big thank you to everyone who was able to attend the call. And of course, a big thanks to Joan for giving her time today and giving us a really great introduction to IGSNs. It was good to hear from you guys, and we appreciate the questions. This slide just has a few links to some additional resources, and we're going to send out, as usual, a follow-up email after the call with these slides, which will have the hyperlinks in them and a recording as well.
Hey, Sarah, I just posted in the chat. It's just the DataCite schema, but I just wanted to link to if you go to page 25 within the schema, that gives you the list of relation types. And then Terry's question with object type, DataCite calls it resource type general. So that gives you like the list of, we sometimes call them product types, object types, but that would give the list for you guys to view, and that's on page 16.
Great, thank you, Stephanie. All right, well, what's next? We will be taking a summer hiatus. So our next call will be in August 24th, which is the usual fourth Tuesday of the month. Our topic is still to be determined. If anyone from the community is interested in presenting, please let us know. And we will be sure to send out an invite about 2 weeks before the meeting with more information. So be sure to be on the lookout for that. Suggestions for topics that you'd like to present, or if you have Mentimeter questions that you want to pose, you can always contact us at doe.dataid@osce.gov or iad@osce.gov. I just want to thank you again for joining today, and thank you again to Joan. It's always a pleasure. Enjoy the rest of your summer and have a great afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you all, and thank you to Joan. That was great.
Thanks.
Thank you.